Chapter 1. Georgia on my mind. Somewhere in the back of a drawer in my mother's house was hidden a small black and white photograph of me that I'd never laid eyes on. She couldn't bring herself to share it with me and broke down each time it was even mentioned. To the day she died, the pain of the moment that picture was taken in 1947 was as raw as ever, and the woman later known as Georgia Holt couldn't bear to be reminded of it. From what little I'd learned, the tiny square of celluloid depicted me as a baby clinging unhappily to the rails of my crib in a Catholic children's home in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It was taken through a small viewing window by my tearful 20-year-old mom at the time, still Jackie Jean, her birth name, a singer from rural Arkansas working for tips as a waitress in an all-night diner. She'd come to see me on one of her weekly visits to the home where my father had placed me before he took off on his latest money-making scam. I still can't believe he left her in Scranton with a baby, no money, and few skills, never to return. The nuns took in two types of waifs and strays, teenage girls who'd strayed from the path of virtue and infants rescued from evil surroundings. I guess I fell into the latter category. The sisters charged my mother $4.50 a week, and with the tips she'd made at the diner, she was just able to make ends meet. Often when I think of my family history, it sounds like the opening of a Dickens novel, but it's true. Ours was a sad, strange story of Southern folk coming from nothing and carving out a life after the Great Depression. It wasn't pretty, and it was never easy. Every day was a fight for survival for most of my family, going back generations. Resilience is in my DNA. In another photograph Mom kept for years, her maternal grandparents and their children were captured on the front porch of their funky-ass log cabin in the backwoods of Missouri, flanked by their hound dog. Actually, I'll show you that picture. The one with the dog. Okay, this is that picture. There. You can tell how hard their life was by the state of the cabin and the look on my grandfather's face. Not one person in the picture was smiling, least of all my great-grandfather Isaac, Gully, a railroad worker with a bushy beard. He once snapped the neck of my grandmother's beloved pet kitten after it got into their bucket of milk. They were so poor there wasn't anything that could be spared, not even for a kitten. She remembered that every day for the rest of her life because she loved that kitten so much and even taught it tricks, including how to push a doll's buggy. I wish I knew more about my great-grandmother Margaret, who wore her hair in long braids and was the woman in her community who would go into the forest and gather herbs for medicine. With knowledge inherited from her own mother and the local Native Americans, or original people, as I now know they prefer to be called, she knew which herbs and roots to pick from the forest to make natural cures. She also knew some of the tribal dances, which she taught to her children. With the psychic abilities that also ran in my family, she sometimes had premonitions in her dreams, and in 1923 had a vivid nightmare that her husband blew up and then fell to the ground in a million tiny pieces like confetti. It was so real to her that the following day she gathered her children around to tell them. By nightfall, her husband Isaac was dead. Isaac blew up stumps for the railroad for a living, and that day he lit too close to the dynamite fuse. He was blown sky high in the explosion. Widowed and penniless, Margaret struggled to feed her family, and when she lost their small farm, she could only afford to keep the two youngest boys, sending the rest to relatives they didn't know. Hey,
on whether the government could ban
come on now.
TikTok for this morning.
Oh my gosh, come on guys. I know. Okay. Nope. Okay. Just saving the two young boys. Okay. Widowed and penniless, Margaret struggled to feed her family, and when she lost her small farm, she could only afford to keep the two youngest boys, sending the rest to relatives they didn't know. Skinny, shy, and tiny for her 10 years, my grandmother, Linda, had to move in with relatives she hated. To pay for her keep, she was sent to work in a boarding house where one of her chores was to fetch the bread from the local bakery. That's where she met my grandfather, Roy Crouch, a baker's assistant who'd fled an abusive childhood in Oklahoma to work in a cafe owned by his elder sister Zella, a tall, dignified, and colorful lady everybody adored. In those days, in rural areas, history was passed down orally between generations. It wasn't written. It was the same in my family, so no one seemed to know for sure how old Roy and Linda were when they first met. I was told that Roy was 16 and Linda was 12. Who knows? The second youngest of 9 children, Roy didn't get along with his mother, Laura Bell Green. According to family folklore, Laura Bell was an imposing figure, almost 6 feet tall and part Cherokee. She had a fierce temper and beat her smart-mouthed son with a buggy whip. Despite that, I wish I'd known her, as she was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman who passed on her love of music to her children and ultimately to me. Once, when she beat him badly, Roy's sisters, my great aunts Zella and Clara, who doted on their kid brother, carried him to the spring house and dabbed his cuts with ointment. Desperate to escape, Roy dreamed of becoming an outlaw like Jesse James or Pretty Boy Floyd. But then he met Grandma Linda and fell for the 12-year-old farm girl with no life experience. After a moonlit swim together, she was pregnant and gave birth at the age of 13 to my mother, Jackie Jean, in 1926. Linda was too young to cope with a baby, and Roy, tired of her complaining, turned to other women and the illegal whiskey known as moonshine during the Prohibition years. When he was drunk, he sometimes beat her, continuing the cycle of violence that began when he was small. Growing up, I heard that he was arrested more than 30 times for violence and drunkenness, and having known him from childhood when he visited us in the summer, I could well believe it. After attacking the local sheriff, who tried to arrest him for bootlegging, Roy went on the run with Linda and their baby, living the outlaw life he'd always dreamed of. They could only find menial labor, so he and Linda picked cotton. My mother's earliest memory is of being pulled over uneven ground on a burlap gunny sack while her mom picked cotton, my Grandma Linda stopping every couple of hours to nurse her. A thumbsucker, Jackie Jean was given one of the fluffy white balls as a pacifier. A full day's labor in the hot sun was worth a gallon of molasses that the family ate with biscuits or stale bread. Their sole diet apart from the occasional wild rabbit. The only time their bellies were full was when they sneaked back to Zella's bakery for a free meal. Hey, can you stop? No, come on. Don't do that. Thank you. They were saved from starvation by donated government relief beans, canned milk, flour, and lard. Linda had to stand in line for hours to get them. It was the Great Depression, the worst financial collapse in the history of America, in which tens of thousands died of malnutrition and diseases. Jackie Jean was a sickly child who contracted rheumatic fever and strep throat that her grandmother Margaret treated with herbal remedies. When she became dangerously ill with German measles, her parents couldn't afford a doctor, so they handed her over to the Salvation Army until she was well enough to be returned. Despite almost dying, my mother grew into a pretty child with a singing voice so powerful it could have been that of a grown woman. I guess this apple didn't fall far from that tree. People were astonished to hear her sing, and Roy would swell up with pride for the daughter he affectionately called Jack. Linda, still only a child, never really took to motherhood, so Jackie Jean saved her love for her daddy, who was caring and fun when sober. He took her everywhere, including to speakeasies, swinging her up on the counter to sing while he drank. The first time he passed around his hat for her in the Shamrock Saloon in St. Louis with its spittoons and sawdust floor, he was astonished to collect 16 cents. After buying some liquor, he gave the change to his daughter, who ran to the grocery store to buy a pack of tea, a block of ice, and a bag of sugar for her teenage mother, knowing how much she longed for the sweet tea that her own mother had made her. With her final penny, Jackie Jean treated herself to some candy. The moment Roy saw that his 5-year-old child, with the voice of a blues singer, could turn him a profit, he declared her the breadwinner. On a good night, people would throw so many nickels that when she stuffed them into her pockets, the weight almost pulled down her pants. Although grateful for the money her daughter was earning, her mother was jealous of the attention she was getting and, tired of Roy's neglect and refusal to get married, ran away. She just disappeared and left my mom. Roy looked everywhere for Linda and listed her as a missing person. When he couldn't find her, he took Jackie Jean to stay with his sister Ladima and her husband Wesley. Her uncle molested her. He swore her to secrecy, so she never told her father. And when she finally confessed to her Aunt Lodima, she had her mouth washed out with carbolic soap. Helpless, she asked Jesus to save her, and maybe it worked because she caught the chicken pox and was moved into the kitchen where she couldn't be abused. Jackie Jean's only escape was her singing, and she practiced every day with Roy coaching her. When they sang Danny Boy together, she felt safe. I could fly away from the trouble and the pain when I sang, she said. Having found my own escape in music my whole life, I knew exactly what she meant. After leaving St. Louis, the pair headed to Southtown in the poorest part of Oklahoma City, where Jackie Jean belted out numbers like Minnie the Moocher and the St. Louis Blues on WKY radio. One day, Jack, you'll be really gonna be somebody, her father kept promising. Even Judy Garland doesn't sing as good as you. She sang duets with bandleader Bob Willis's popular Hillbilly Swing Band whenever they came into town. It was Bob Willis who told Roy, "That little girl's gonna make you rich." With his hopes raised and prohibition lifted in 1933, my grandfather continued to drag her to every smoke-filled bar in town. No matter how tired or hungry she was and barefoot on the counter because she didn't have shoes, she kept going until they'd collected enough for food and liquor. The stink of those bars remained with my mother forever. She always said the movie Paper Moon perfectly depicted her childhood, except that her father wasn't hawking Bibles, he was selling her voice. Roy never stopped searching for Linda, and when he finally tracked her down, he got her pregnant again and persuaded her to come back. The couple had no money for rent and lived on day-old bread soaked in watery gravy. They were only saved from eviction because the landlady took pity on Linda when she almost died from a kidney infection shortly before my Uncle Mickey was born. Poorer than he'd ever been, Grandpa needed a dream, and Jackie Jean was it. Bob Willis had told him her talents were wasted in Oklahoma, so Roy decided to take her to Hollywood, where he was convinced she'd become the new Shirley Temple, the child star who was making $1,000 per week. It was in the winter of 1934 that my 8-year-old mother began hitchhiking the 1,300 miles west with her dad. Broke and hungry, they slept where they could, using Mom's voice to get into cheap hotels. No longer barefoot, she wore a beat-up pair of cowboy boots on the end of her matchstick legs, but the snow was so deep in places that it spilled over the top. A couple who gave them a ride bought my mom her first coat because they couldn't bear to see her shivering by the side of the highway, and a Greyhound bus ferried them across New Mexico for free before paying for their night and a motel. Along the way, Roy put Mom to work selling Christmas cards on street corners and collecting empty soda bottles at movie theaters in return for free admission. Once inside, Jackie Jean stared up in wonder at the silver screen, watching movies like Little Women with Katharine Hepburn or Sons of the Desert with Laurel and Hardy, and vowed to be a star one day. Hollywood became her obsession, but when they finally made it to the slums of San Pedro in South Los Angeles, she was shocked to find that the fabled city looked nothing like it did in the movies. Even more distressing was the fact that everyone made fun of them, calling them dumb Okies because of their accents and shabby clothing. Life and genetics had already taught her that unless she was strong enough to keep putting one foot in front of the other, she wouldn't make it. She might have been dirt poor, but she carried herself like a queen. Roy was a farm boy who hadn't a clue how to get his daughter's talent noticed, so when the overnight success he'd hoped for never materialized, he took a job as a baker at a branch of Clifton's, the iconic cafeteria chain in L.A. The moment his boss first set eyes on Jackie Jean, he gave her $2 to buy some proper shoes, claiming to have found the cash lying under a table. And despite looking like a homeless person with lice in her hair, Mom still won every amateur singing contest she entered and appeared regularly on the radio singing with Jimmy Wakely and his saddle pals. She was even offered a scholarship with the Magdalen Kitties youth troupe where Judy Garland had trained, but had to turn down this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity when she couldn't afford the required tap shoes. While her father was at work, she hung out at the 5-cent movies all day, dodging creeps in the dark. At night, it was too dangerous for her to be left alone, so she slept on the bakery's dough tables. Once he'd saved up enough, he paid for Linda and baby Mickey to join them from Oklahoma, but Linda was horrified to discover that he'd fathered another child by a teenage girl. It was news to Jackie Jean, too, and she worried about her half-sibling for a long time. Faced with the prospect of losing Linda again, Roy slipped back to his old friend bourbon. Addiction doesn't just run in my family, it gallops, and its unhappy consequences have been repeated with dreadful symmetry throughout my life. Forced to give up his Hollywood dream, my grandfather went back east with his wife and son. He tied a name tag around Jackie Jean's neck and put her on a train to his sister Zella in Arkansas. Although she missed her father and brother terribly, Mom spent the happiest 6 months of her childhood in her aunt's comfortable home. Zella, who I loved, was a force of nature who loved Jackie Jean like a daughter. The kid who'd owned nothing was cleaned up, was put in pretty dresses, and had ribbons threaded into her hair. She won a statewide amateur talent contest in her category for singing the blues. Zella wanted to adopt her and one day send her to college, but when Jackie Jean found out that... Dang it, cat. Come on. This isn't enough. Come on. Zella wanted to adopt her and one day send her to college, but when Jackie Jean found out that Linda had walked out on Roy for good, leaving Mickey behind, she was so afraid for her little brother that she went back home to keep him safe. She found them living in the slums of Oklahoma City. Roy was still so desperate to get Linda back that when he found out where she was working, he bullied her into visiting her kids. Too afraid to tell him that she'd married a Sicilian man, she agreed. Shocked by how her children were living, she returned a few days later with some money and clothes, but Roy forced her into bed. After the Sicilian found out what happened, he knocked several of Grandpa's teeth out and told his wife that he'd adopt her children. Soon afterward, my grandfather received a court order informing him that he had lost custody, news that finally tipped him over the edge. My mother's recollection of what must have been the worst night of her life was always patchy. It was only when I paid for her to go into therapy years later that the details were finally unlocked. Staying in that crummy place full of crawling things that bit them, Jackie Jean forced herself to lay awake for fear that men might break in and molest them. As she stared out the window, she told herself, "When I grow up, I will not live this way." She must have dozed off because later she woke up to the sound of hissing. Not quite awake, she imagined for a moment that the room was full of snakes, but then saw a shadowy figure across their room. Highly attuned to danger, she pretended to be asleep until he'd left. Choking, she suddenly realized that it wasn't snakes she could hear, but gas. Jumping up, she grabbed Mickey and ran with him to a neighbor who called the police. It was only later that my mom realized the shadowy figure she'd seen at 3 a.m. was her father. She recognized his gait and a distinctive smell of fresh yeast. Roy had come back from his shift, turned on the gas, and left. She'd heard his steps disappearing down the stairs. The scariest part for her was that Roy was stone cold sober. "Hey, no, come here. Come here, buddy. Hey, stop." He was sober, and for a long time she couldn't admit to herself that the only parent who ever seemed to love her and my Uncle Mickey had tried to end their lives. The children moved with their mother and Cecilian's stepfather to a district of Los Angeles named Gardenia. With identical houses and tiny lawns, that stretch of town went on for miles. Roy stayed in Oklahoma and had no contact with the children he'd attempted to murder, even though his daughter still missed him. That year was only made better for Jackie Jean by her stepfather, who gave her the affectionate nickname String Bean. He was the only kind man she had ever known. Once again, though, Linda grew jealous of their closeness, and when my mom reached 13, the same age her mother had been when she'd given birth to her, she told her she'd have to go back to live with Roy. She was leaving the Sicilian for his nephew and taking Mickey with her. I mean, geez, my family, you couldn't make it up. She couldn't face the chaos of life with her father. Hey, Zeke, come here. I'm almost done with this chapter. Come here, right now. You're just trying to get attention, and it's annoying. Here. She couldn't face the chaos of life with her father, so Jackie Jean scanned the want ads and found work as a live-in maid in Hancock Park. Her employer's home was huge and her chores tough, but my mother never complained because it was the best place she'd ever lived. Vermin-free, it had clean sheets, and there was a hot meal on the table every evening. As long as all her work was done, she was allowed to attend a local high school during the day and study late at night. Mom became well-read, got good grades, and worked on improving her Okie accent by reading aloud to herself. Afraid that the rich girls at school might discover how she lived, she got them to like her by showing off her vocal chops. She also played on her image as a nerdy bookworm, too busy editing the school yearbook to socialize or spend money she didn't have. With the encouragement of her teachers, she finally became the somebody her daddy always wanted her to be, although it broke her heart that nobody in her immediate family cared. Every night, she curled up on the bathroom floor, sobbing into a towel so that no one could hear her, and there were times when she even considered killing herself. Something stopped her. A determination to survive passed on through the female line. Studying hard for a scholarship to college, Jackie Jean was devastated when Roy wrote and begged her to come home. He'd fallen off a curb in Oklahoma City and broken several ribs, putting him in a full body cast. At 15, she gave up her dreams of higher education, and out of a strange mix of pity, love, and duty, she went back to care for her father. But she was determined to return to the city she thought of as a home. She told me I knew I had to try to climb up and get back to Los Angeles. Little did she know where that decision would lead both of us. And so concludes chapter 1.